Well, hey, all you wiretappers out there. Good to be back here in the studio. Gangland Wire. This is Gary Jenkins, retired Kansas City Police Intelligence Unit detective. I have a story today I've been researching for a while, and I've had several people ask me about organized crime in Denver, Colorado. The Smaldone family ruled it for a long time. So we're going to go take a look at Denver, Colorado. You don't think of Denver, Colorado having the mob, you just think of going skiing, the Rockies, and I can't think of their football team all of a sudden. Anyhow, it kind of started more. The earliest is down in Pueblo, Colorado, which is a few miles, I don't know, 100 or so miles, a couple of hundred maybe south of Denver. A guy named James Coletti was caught at the Appalachian Conference in 1957, and he had been in Pueblo for a long time. He was born in Italy. When he first got to the United States, he was arrested several times in New York City and the New Jersey area. Then he moved west and settled in Pueblo. At one time, he was listed as a member, in the early days, he was listed as a member of the Bonanno family. And that's probably because he was involved with the ownership of the Colorado Cheese Company with Joe Bonanno. So I would say he was a Bonanno affiliated mobster, more than likely, and a made guy too, if he was at Appalachian. After him in Pueblo, he was there during this time. There's a brothers named Pete and Sam Carlino, and Pete Carlino got the nickname the Al Capone of Southern Colorado during Prohibition, because there was a lot of bootlegging going on at the time, as there was all over the United States. And they really wanted to expand their bootlegging empire from Pueblo on up to the bigger city and the capital city of Denver. Now, there was a guy named Joe Roma who was supposedly, quote unquote, the boss of Denver, and he had a sit down with these brothers, Carlino brothers, and trying to head off into kind of a gang war. In 1931, this Joe Roma, he was kind of like, he was more like Al Capone, or maybe more like Lucky Luciano. He had a meeting of 30 of Colorado's top bootleggers in order to try to divide districts up and areas up, or who had what area, keep troubles down. And the cops at the time, of course, they were probably corrupt as hell, but they found out about it. And since these were all Italians, I'm sure they were all Peckerwood cops, they raided the meeting, and the meeting was interrupted. There's really no compromise was ever agreed on. And what happened out of that was a gang war. A few months later, Pete Carlino was standing on a Denver sidewalk, and some gunmen and a automobile, a drive-by shooting, blasted him. They blasted the shit out of him, but he survived. 3 months later, he and James Coletti, who I mentioned before, were killed at Carlino's home. So it's kind of interesting. Another member of the Carlino gang went to the police and cooperated with the police, and he identified a guy named Bruno Morrow of Pueblo as the gunman. But in a kind of another bizarre twist of the war, this Joe Roma, he did not want gang warfare. He just wanted to make money again, like Frank Costello or Lucky Luciano. Roma posted a $5,000 bail for his rival, Pete Carlino, Sam's brother at that point in time. And after Carlino had been arrested on some kind of a arson charge, a conspiracy to commit arson. So, go figure. But that's kind of some of the really early history that we can find of Denver and Colorado organized crime families in connection with the Mafia. Now, Pete Carlino had been bonded out by Joe Roma, who was the Denver guy who was trying to keep peace among the bootleggers. He was up in Denver, and he drove out to Cannon City, which is just outside of Denver, around September the 9th, 10th, or 11th. Found his body stuffed underneath a bridge, and they said 2 days later, the killers returned to move his body, to move it to a place where it could be more easily discovered. They wanted it discovered. A lot of these mob guys, they like to send a message, so they wanted to send a message. This has become, what's interesting about this, that was around the same time as Joe Mazzaria, or was it Maranzano? One of those, it was Maranzano was killed, and they called that the Night of Sicilian Vespers in New York City. Well, that didn't really happen. They didn't kill mob guys all over the United States in that night. That's a pretty good rumor and a pretty good story, but this guy was killed about the same time. Best I can tell, and best I've researched this thing before I did a whole show on the night of the Sicilian Vespers and the myth behind that and how that didn't really happen. But that would be one mob murder that they would link to that and to try to make that story true. This leaves Joe Roma as the organized crime leader in Colorado. He was called Little Caesar because he was 5'1" and kind of a bigger than life personality. And he was a crime boss until his murder in 1933. We don't know exactly who did it, but I got a feeling it might have had something to do with the Smaldone family. There's another prominent family involved in Denver area organized crime and bootlegging and gambling and all that, and that's the Smaldone family. There were three brothers. I think the oldest was Clyde. They called him Flip Flop. Smaldone. There was Eugene, and he was known as Checkers Smaldone. And then there was Clarence, who was Chauncey Smaldone. They were all involved in the bootlegging in the 20s and gambling all the way up into the 1980s. And they will dominate the underworld in Denver and Colorado, eastern Colorado, and the headlines too until the 1990s. Now these brothers all together. They owned and operated a restaurant in North Denver, probably the Little Italy area in North Denver called Gaetano's. Gaetano's Italian restaurant. Now, supposedly Gaetano was Italian for Clyde's. I'm not sure about that. I read that. They were questioned about the murder of Roma, but nothing ever came of it. Almost the earliest days, during the 40s, by the end of the war, this place, Gaetano's in the Little Italy neighborhood in North Denver, was known as a mob hangout. Everybody knew it as a mob hangout. We all, especially in smaller cities like this, we have a place that's known as a mob hangout. Besides his intellect, Clyde, or Flip Flop, was known for making a lot of friends, and he made friends throughout the United States. He got to know Al Capone back in the day. He got to know Carlos Marcello. Later on, he was friends with one of the Colorado governors, Ralph Carr, and everybody that knew him described him as a real gentleman. He was a real smooth personality, if you will. Born in 1906, and he started out, as all of them, with a burglary charge, or not all of them, but with some kind of a smaller criminal charge, and he served 18 months in Leavenworth for bootlegging in the 30s, 1933. After he got out, he served some time for the attempted bombing murder of a local guy named Leon Barnes. Now, his younger brother, Eugene, who went by Checkers, they were always at Gaetano's. They always they were these restaurateurs who would walk around, and you've been there, locally owned, especially Italian places. They'll come around and say, "Is everything okay? Is food okay?" And that kind of a thing, and get to know people and real personable. Clyde always dressed immaculately in really expensive suits, and he always had a cigar in his mouth. Everybody knew him. Everybody knew the Smaldones. And the general manager during those later years, he will say that he said 10 out of 11 people that knew them will have nothing but great things to say about the family. They say that nobody in the neighborhood ever went hungry, no matter how bad times were. The Smaldones would always help out. 1953, Clyde and Eugene, or Checkers, made headlines after a publicized raid of one of their gambling dens in Brighton, Colorado, and they were later found guilty of jury tampering, and they really socked it to them. They gave him 60 years in prison and a huge big fine, 1953, $24,000 fine. Now, after 13 months in jail, a little over a year in jail, they got a new trial, and they pled out then and got a little less time. Clyde ended up getting 12 years, and he got a parole in 1962. By 1967, he's back at it, and he and several others, including Checker's son, were arrested on gambling charges and for running a $100,000 a week bookmaking operation. Now, Clyde will start pulling back during these years, the 60s, and Checkers, or Eugene, will become known as Northern Colorado's leading crime figure, like all of Colorado's leading crime figure, and the patriarch of the Denver crime family. He was the man by then. Suspected of taking part in or being behind several murders. He was never indicted for murder. Over his years, he was arrested for auto theft, bootlegging, income tax evasion. People would describe him as a schoolteacher type. He wore glasses, he's very polite, very civil, good mob guy. He doesn't act like a criminal. He'll catch a case for operating a loan shark business out of Gaetano's. He also, Eugene, and with Clarence, the younger brother, who was known as Chauncey, and their nephew, Paul Clyde Fat Paulie Bonanno, pled guilty to several charges, including illegal gun possession. Now, Checkers will die in 1992 of a heart attack at age 81. Now, in the later years, Clyde and Checkers, or Eugene, were much less involved in the family's rackets, and the youngest brother, Clarence, known as Chauncey, took over for the most part. Chauncey was known as the handsomest brother, the best-looking brother, and he had a particular table at Gaetano's that he'd always sat at in the far back, and that restaurant's still there today, guys, if you go to Denver. It's table number 404. They have a famous hamburger that's still on the menu called the Chauncey Burger. It's a half a pound of ground chuck, mozzarella, melted mozzarella, and roasted Italian peppers, served with a side of the house red sauce. You have to try that if you ever get out there. Let me know if you do. As of 1999, Chauncey was still alive, and he was considered kind of the the underboss or the boss. I'm not. Maybe one of his brothers was still alive, of a 2-member mob family. Never were. This family never was a national kind of an entity. I know in Kansas City, we had, we heard that there were some connections between Kansas City and them. I don't know. I don't really remember anybody ever coming that. But one thing they did get involved in, they were connected to St. Louis, and we got that documented. In 1981, there was an FBI investigation, and it revealed that Checkers and his brother Chauncey, the youngest brother, had partnered up with Anthony Giordano, who was the boss of the St. Louis family, and they were in a scheme to skim money from the Las Vegas Riviera Casino. They got excerpts. They had wiretaps on them. There was conversations between them, and the Bureau would claim that Giordano and the St. Louis family kind of had the dominant position in this relationship. Now, they were also connected with Detroit in this too, and Chicago. So this connected them with these other 3 families. One time they watched a St. Louis mobster named William Spinelli meet the Smaldones in Denver, talk about their arrangement. Another occasion when a nephew of Anthony Giordano, a guy named Jimmy Giammanco, came to Denver, and he met with Chauncey Smaldone, and one time they even met with Joey Dubs Iupa from Chicago about their investment in Las Vegas casinos. Now, I mentioned before there was Paul Fat Willie Bonanno, who was a nephew of Checker Smaldone, and he was kind of their point of contact. He would be almost like their underboss, their street guy who kind of handled things on the street. He was their point of contact regarding their investment in the Riviera, and they had several conversations between Riviera executives and this Bonanno. And what they talked about was a collection of overdue markers or gambling debts to the casino. So I assume that was part of their deal, that if the Riviera had people that owed them money around the country, why the Smaldones, through this Bonanno, Fat Willie Bonanno, would then go collect these debts. The Bureau watched Bonanno travel to St. Louis and meet with Giordano associate and underboss, and I think maybe the boss for a short period of time, John Batali, at least on one occasion. And here's what the Bureau learned on how they got their skim out. Everybody's got a different way. They took it out of the count room in the Trop for Kansas City and brought it back with a guy who ran a junket out there back and forth between Kansas City and Las Vegas. So they had a kind of a unique way of getting their skim out of Riviera. It wasn't as good a way. You didn't get the cash money quite as easily. They would send a guy out, and he was given a huge line of credit. Now, mainly, I think what he did, he played a little bit, then he cashed in his chips. He got all the money in chips and played a little bit, and then cashed it in, took the cash back. But they also would, if he gambled, and he would gamble, if he won, he kept all the cash. If he lost, the Riviera executive just destroyed any evidence of this line of credit or the marker that he had signed. So that's kind of that was their one entry into the big time. Clyde will die in a nursing home at age 91. His son, who never got involved with the Bob, said that despite his father's criminal past, he had a soft side and donated to local orphanages and churches and schools and different things. They were that kind of guy. They say you can go to Gaetano's today, and it's still Clyde's favorite bar stools there and marked, and the table number 404 is marked. And the tricky thing I think about figuring out the Smaldones, and a lot of mob families are like that, but I've never really heard this quite so strongly. Is what I read about them, is that depending on who you talk to, they were either modern day Robin Hoods or they were shoot 'em up mafioso right straight out of a gangster flick. Of course, in reality, they were neither. The story is always somewhere in between. The stories about their generosity was true. Nobody in the neighborhood went hungry. They helped people out, helped people in the neighborhood out, helped people that they were connected to out, family members out. They helped destitute families with milk and groceries. They secretly paid college tuition for some local boys, and they funded Catholic orphanages. And that was reported in the Denver Post magazine called a Roundup magazine. But at the same time, the Denver Post was always reporting on their criminal activity. They donated huge quantities of athletic equipment to kids. And I don't know. There's really no. It's typical mob guys, And that's what I find so interesting about this is nobody's all good or bad. A lot of your criminals, your serial killers and the booger eating morons that are out here stealing your car and robbing the grocery stores or the 7-Elevens, as we used to call them, 7-Eleven robbers and street muggings and all that. You're kind of normal, small time, day-to-day criminals. They're not out doing any good. Mob guys, they have families, they help people out. They just, partly on one hand, as many of the old guys learned, and Frank Costello was a perfect example of this, you need to maintain a good front out there and keep the law enforcement off your butt when you're running these rackets. And the rackets that they ran, for the most part, are, bootlegging. People wanted booze. Everybody wanted booze. Gambling, everybody likes to gamble. Maybe not everybody, but a lot of people like to gamble. Mainly, they provide a product that most people want. And mainly, if there's any enforcement activity where people get hurt, well, it's somewhere within the family, even with loan sharking. Anybody that ends up going to a loan shark, more than likely, they're a degenerate gambler. And that's why they've been involved in a variety of different criminal behaviors already, where the embezzlement, for example, that's the ones that end up with a loan shark. And that's the ones that, when they can't pay it back, they get beat up, or they allow, lots of times if they have a company, they'll allow the mob to come and bust it out so they can get their money back. So it's such an interesting subculture that I'm going to keep doing this because it is so fascinating to me. And there's a whole lot of other mob. Every time I think I've heard every mob story there was, I look closer and I see, or I get a message from somebody and there's something that I haven't talked about or haven't covered. Try to, get outside of New York and Chicago. And there's still tons, there's tons of mob stories in both those cities. I've covered Denver, of course, Dallas and Kansas City, and then Rochester, New York, upstate New York. I think I need to do, the guy in Buffalo. All of a sudden I've lost his name. Magliocco. No, not Magliocco. Anyhow, I'll figure it out. I'll get it done. But it's, there's other smaller families out there, Rock Island, Illinois. I did a little bit on that, but that was mainly from under the pizza connection. I didn't really get into what was going on there. And I found out recently that there was a lot more going on in downstate Illinois than what I realized. Peoria, there's a little bit going on down there. Newport, Kentucky, and along that state line down there, Indiana into Kentucky and Ohio. There was a lot of stuff going on there. Johnstown, Pennsylvania, a lot going on there. I've done Cleveland. What's about Cincinnati? I've never done Cincinnati, and I've never really, really got into Detroit too much, and a couple stories. But anyhow, we just keep spinning them out there, guys, and I really appreciate all you supporting the podcast. Every once in a while I get a donation still, which, that's wonderful. It kind of keeps me going. I'll tell you right now, it kind of keeps me going. And, you're buying my books and all that kind of thing. So don't forget, if you have a problem with PTSD, go to the VA website and get that hotline number. And mixing this up a little bit, you know I like to ride motorcycles, so watch out for motorcycles when you're out there driving your F-150. And if you have a problem with drugs or alcohol, get down to Mr. Ruggiano down in Florida. Look at that hotline, find that hotline number on his website, get hooked up with him. Be sure and go to my website and check out my books and movies. You can I got a way that you can stream my movies for $1.99 off my website now. Of course, I got my books. If you want the hard copies for sale, you can get them probably cheaper on Amazon. I don't even know what I put. I think I put a kind of a higher price up there for some reason. I don't even know why. Mainly I sell them off Amazon anyhow. If people donate, then I make sure you get a book. Whatever you donate, there's some ways to donate and some stuff I'll give you. Anyhow, guys, I really appreciate you supporting this page, supporting my podcast, Gangland Wire podcast group, YouTube channel, and all that stuff. Like and subscribe. Tell your friends about it, and just keep coming back, guys. We got a new story every week or so. Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys.